their new event subscription feature, and we wanted to talk about it. There's just so much conversation going on X about it. It touches on so many of the points that developers have been complaining about webhooks over the last probably decade at this point. So we figured we'd go live.
Yeah, it's a really
Sorry,
exciting
having
update.
echo on the live stream. All right. So I have here with us Jordan. Jordan is the founder of Fimsicle and also the host of several events in the UK, Shopify North. We have Taylor Page as well. Taylor, you probably all know already if you're joining the live stream. He's the host of the Liquid Weekly podcast and also manages the the Shop Dev Alliance. I'm actually glad to finally be able to turn the mic on you. You're usually the one doing the interviewing. And then we have Sandesh joining
Scary.
us from Stock. We met last year when they won the Shopify Dev Awards and some of the best app developer out there. So figured I'd try to get the perspective both from like the app developer business side of things and also like kind of the technical weeds of what Shopify has announced. So let's get into it. Just to kick things off, I'm curious to just get your impression on, what you see that very much kind of changing for you, practically speaking. And maybe Sandesh, we can start with you because I remember when we met, one of the very first thing that you told me was complaining about all the webhooks that you received that you don't actually need to tackle, and a lot of that conversation was around cost at that time. I'm curious to see how you think about it now.
Yeah, I remember that. I think the first time we met, I probably chewed your ear away for an hour about how we consume a lot of webhooks and it's really painful and we really need a better solution than that because there's no reason for us to ingest everything. Um, I'm really excited about this. We got to play around with the early access and just to give some context, like we looked at all our webhooks for for the last while and the math came out to like 95% of webhooks are just discarded or no opt eventually and we just have no control over the filter. Merchants decide to do something in the admin, we get a webhook about it. 9 times out of 10, actually 9.5 times out of 10, it's irrelevant to us. And that just means that no matter what we do, we have to continue scaling up with the amount of webhooks that come in. At least that was the case until this came out. So I'm really, really excited for this. The one cost, I think, in general with building Shopify apps, you're constantly thinking about like optimizing your costs. And the one cost that we had no control over for the longest time has been consuming webhooks and making sure that we actually action on them. So for the first time we do. And I feel like this should have been something like we got 5 years ago. So too late, not too early either, but very great. Very happy that it's here.
I do want to piggyback on that. Obviously, like, we've been involved with a bunch of Shopify app developers and their webhooks as well, and the experience that you shared around those no-op webhooks is just something we hear about all the time. But I think the thing that's interesting there is that it tends to be very concentrated in product and product update webhooks for the most part. And so when you think about, it could have been done 5 years ago, I think one thing that I find interesting or where my mind went with this update is that it kind of went nuclear instead of saying, well, figure out a way to reduce the product update webhooks. It's just no. We're gonna change it all, right? But I will say they're also kind of like solving, I think, a bunch of other issues that we're gonna touch on during that conversation. But I find it interesting how they were clearly listening, but I think they were kind of waiting to like bundle a bunch of changes all together. Taylor, you want to piggyback on that? I think one thing that I've seen that really caught my attention was Prakar, the founder of Foxtel, was kind of saying how they now plan on moving fully away from polling to event based because of this change, and that he didn't see that as viable with the prior webhooks. Is that something that you also see will like beyond just kind of like a cost concern change how you build apps?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm like the least experienced person in this call about like webhooks and everything else. I just get to listen to all of y'all talk about a lot of this stuff, and I dabble in apps, but not nearly to the scale, obviously, that y'all have to worry about. So yeah, Prakar is like a great example as far as that goes with, you know, just how people are rethinking like webhooks, right? So I think, yeah, like that makes a lot of sense as far as the move or the transition is going to be, kind of seeing how this lands, especially as it starts to cover like more surface areas. Because I think initially it's products and customers, I think, off the
yeah.
bat. And so, like really excited. Obviously, everyone's gonna be, orders and everything else or whatever, because there's loads of very helpful information in there as well that people are, don't necessarily need all this extra stuff. And filtering and stuff has helped like tremendously up until this point, but has this is the next evolution from that piece. So yeah, I think it's gonna completely change how people approach that at all.
Yeah, and to speculate a little bit, as you touch on the customers and product, do you see them kind of like going live with a stable version without having full coverage of all the different topics, or is that something that you think they will progressively roll out and have a stable release with only a few kind of topics supported?
Yeah, I mean, purely speculation, right? But Shopify loves
That's
this
what we're here
whole
for.
like, right? Yeah, this is all speculation. Like, no one has an inside track here. And don't think it's like we haven't tried either. Like, I was like bugging people or whatever. Like, we haven't tried. It's just, but yeah, like as far as how it goes, Shopify like really loves this space of like releasing stuff early. It's this weird tension of like we want the early stuff, but then we kind of get upset that it's not already ready by the time we get it, and then people are kind of mad about it. But like this is hinting at where it's going, right? So yeah, 100%. I think as far as like moving into like we're rolling out with these like as soon as there's some version of stable, and then like adding in more surfaces as it goes. I think that's what people should expect for sure. So and helpful. I mean, they tackle products first because that's incredibly important. Customers as well. Just especially with like all of the pushes that are being made into like customer accounts with like new like customer extensibility and all this other stuff and what have you. It's become increasingly important to have more information for that space than what we had before. So I think that's probably why they started on those surfaces at least.
Yeah, totally. And Jordan, I'd love to hear you on that as well, but I'm going to add one small dimension. One thing that I do see as well from this change is that they're consolidating basically the schemas from the GraphQL API and with the webhooks, right? So kind of like historically, or at least like I think the drift was just getting worse and worse over time, where the webhooks kind of were very much tied with like the old REST API structure, and now we're moving toward kind of like user-defined GraphQL queries. There's just so much to unpack there, but I'm kind of curious to hear you both on how you think it's going to change how you build your apps, but also like the developer experience of those like finally kind of like converging together.
Yeah, so I think I imagine that product and customer updates are probably the most chatty webhooks, which is probably why they've started there. I'm going to take I don't think that's too much of a guess to say that's
Yeah.
probably the case. And so I think that's probably where they start there, and they'll definitely roll it out after that when it gets stable. And I think it's going to change a lot for people. I don't use incredible amounts of webhooks now, but back at when I was an employee at one of the large Shopify companies, we used a lot, and we would get hundreds of thousands of webhooks a day. And like Sandesh said, most of them were duplicates or like inventory changes. The inventory change on the product update webhook is the classic. You get a lot of those as soon as you get many bursts of orders. So I think it's going to be a real game changer. I actually spoke at last year's editions doing about migrating from REST to GraphQL, and one of the number one things that came up was, well, okay, well, that's fine, but now I have to map my webhooks over to my GraphQL format or my GraphQL format back into my REST format so that my webhooks can line up and I can use that. So I think it's going to be a big win for deduplicating all that logic. It's obviously going to be a move for people. There is no doubt about that. There is a lot of change in there to get your head around and setting all that up. So there will be some change, but I think at the end of it, you're probably going to be processing more efficiently and probably having a bit less duplication of code in your life as well, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, and what do you make of kind of like throwing the kitchen sink at it, right? Like, because obviously you do imply like there's going to be all those changes kind of necessary and so on. Do you think that's the right approach? Is that an approach that kind of like resonates with you? Like, let's tackle it all at once rather than trying to like trickle improvements through like what already exists?
I think if you imagine if the product update webhook had changed and like dropped some of the fields, there would be outrage, right? People would be screaming because that webhook has been stable and not changed the fields that have been in that webhook for years and years and years. And again, people don't always update to the latest version. People are running on old versions. There are lots of custom apps out there that are developed by internal agencies, whatever, that don't get a lot of updates. Changing a webhook would be would cause so much outrage that I think there's very little options. You either introduce weird webhook topics of like product update dot something, which then becomes a bit of a strange syntax, or you kind of go like this approach. And I think this approach aligns with a lot of what they're doing, right? So they've rebuilt the product and variant architectures so that they can be more extensible now. They've obviously introduced Shopify functions, which everyone's more comfortable with now, about GraphQL generating the function input. So I think it kind of makes sense to kind of follow that pattern onto webhook and event delivery.
Yeah, totally. One challenge that I see kind of like ahead for them, and I think Arshdeep also kind of referred to that in his announcement post, is around the developer experience of like actually making sure that you're configuring those event subscription correctly, because it's actually kind of finicky a little bit, right? Like you need to define the action and then the triggers, and the triggers I can imagine could get like quite complex if you're interested in multiple fields, right? Like in kind of like the blog examples that they give, there's like maybe one or two field that you're interested in, but like presumably you're probably interested in, a dozen, 20-ish fields. And then from there, you also have the GraphQL query itself that's going to execute from it, and like validating the output of that and so on. So I can definitely see like a bit of a challenge in this, making sure that people are actually configuring the event subscriptions like correctly, and a lot of back and forth kind of like going in your dev space and trying to update the title and then check if whether or not the payload is like the right one and that sort of stuff. What do you make of that? Is that something that you see as a challenge you'll be able to like tackle when they're integrated like tooling in the CLI, or is just kind of like a necessary pain of having to go in that direction that is in some ways like a little bit non-standard, right? Like we haven't really seen any other webhook vendor, at least in my experience, kind of like do user-defined GraphQL based kind of payloads. So you guys have like built a lot with the tools that Shopify built. I maybe have a little bit less exposure, so I'm curious to see like what your thoughts are on that front and the integrated development experience.
Yeah, so I think there's three parts to this really. So the first one is you kind of it is more complex than UTOML, like you are configuring the triggers and the GraphQL queries, but you're just trading that complexity for complexity elsewhere. But otherwise, with webhooks at the minute, you either have to scale up to handle all that load, you have to use a tool like HookDeck to kind of dedupe and evaluate those, or you have to build all your own logic to go through and dedupe and figure out what you're going to handle those. So I think you're just trading the complexity there to move it into the TOML. So there's always going to be that complexity trade-off. I don't think there's any solution here where there isn't some complexity somewhere, and it's just a case of where you want to handle that. I think it's one of the first things I asked when I got access to try this, was if I can generate types from it. So if I can move the GraphQL schema into a GraphQL file, because then I can generate types from it. I'm a TypeScript guy, so I can then generate types from it and use it throughout my application, so I know what I'm going to get, which is really handy. So I'm hopeful that that's going to come in the future. And I think the last bit, I think there's actually a real opportunity here for the community, maybe someone like yourself, Alex, to create a library of standard or like patterns for events. So for example, like product updates, if you're only interested in like the price, for example, these kind of fairly common patterns, because I think, like I said, there is a trade-off, and I think creating almost a library or community-based library of like standard patterns, triggers, GraphQL outputs, I think would be a real game changer for a lot of devs, because then you don't have to, like you say, go and tweak it each time. You might want to do it for your specific use case, but for fairly common standard things, I think that would be a real game changer in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we were just in Paris with the team for a white event, and we're having a little croissant and baguette the next day. It's actually one of the things that we're talking about. So I think that definitely makes a ton of sense. Obviously there's like good feedback, that sort of stuff. We kind of touch on like maybe some of the kind of future looking. This is still unstable, they're working on it. Arshdeep was kind of like explicitly asking for feedback and so on. I'm curious if there's like specific things that you notice that doesn't seem like kind of quite right, you want to get the message across in terms of improvements and future potential that you saw kind of like when this came across.
So, I mean, more topics definitely where I think that's pretty much everyone's feedback. So I'm kind of just stating the obvious at this point. But yeah, we're looking forward to more topics. I just also wanted to say that like them throwing the kitchen sink is like the right thing to do. I'm glad they did it. Just like a quick detour, for those of you in the Shopify world, you probably know about managed pricing. And managed pricing launched like a couple of years ago, and it shipped in such a beta feature set with like no ability to charge usage pricing, for example. And that basically meant nobody could use it properly. But this time around, they've just like given you the whole thing and been like, hey, go crazy and let's get started with this. So I'm really glad for that. But yeah, no feedback for now because we're waiting to like get. So the events we consume the most are on the inventory side and on the order side. So we're really excited to try that out. And then yeah, we'll see from there. I did also get a chance to meet the team in the Shopify office. They asked a ton of questions, great questions about like replayability, and I feel like they're not even done. So even if we think this is the kitchen sink, it seems like there's even more coming down the line.
For sure. Do you want to speculate on some of that?
I was just asked questions. I have no idea as to what will actually ship. But I know that like they care a lot about making sure that teams like developers receive webhooks, because I think one of the other questions and even what you're working on is that like there's this perception that webhooks are unreliable, and at the end of the day like you're not receiving the event that you want from Shopify. At least that's a lot of conversation from people, but I can tell that they really care about it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that they work on, but that's just my guess. I have no real idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. At the end of the day, the name of the game, like the semantics of it is one thing, but the name of the game at the end of the day is like reliability, latency, right? And making sure that's like stable. And so I'm sure that's like top of mind. And I would imagine like what they built must of taking just like enormous effort in terms of pipeline and technical complexity and that sort of stuff. And so whatever they end up building there, I'm sure was, you know, taking into account much broader conversation around delivery guarantees and latency and that sort of stuff. And like you say, it seems like there's a lot more coming. And I think Arshdeep does kind of hint at that in his post as well. It seems like there's a lot more coming where that came from. So that definitely makes a ton of sense to me. So the one more thing I want to touch on is obviously building applications. There's just like all this complexity and so on. And one of the big conversation that there's been is this reconciliation, having to like pull versus receiving the events and so on. Do you see that kind of changing? Because like one of the big thing here that notably hasn't really been said is that the delivery guarantee isn't really changing, right? And so I don't know in your own applications if currently you are still like doing kind of like pull-based reconciliation and so on. Is that something you see kind of like going away, or that still remains kind of like a constraint of trying to like build Shopify apps that rely on those events?
I was going to say that's the one thing that I think that I am waiting for clarification on. If there is guaranteed delivery, that would be incredible. It would solve a lot of headaches and reduce a lot of work in terms of doing that reconciliation loop. The reconciliation loop does get a little bit easier, right? Because you've already written the query effectively in GraphQL, so hopefully you can migrate that over to a bulk job more easily than right now. Whereas right now you're having to, you know, again map the REST fields from the webhook into the GraphQL format and vice versa. So I think that will be super interesting. My big question is what happens to Shopify Flow? Does Shopify Flow continue to use webhooks, or does it also have like an events trigger? Don't know. I am a big fan of Shopify Flow. I think it's super powerful. And so I'm just interested to see what happens there as like, yeah, it's useful for as an app dev. It's very handy for me. But also what happens there, because that would unlock a lot of flexibility for merchants, I think.
Right, and ultimately the same question kind of extends to merchant sites directly as well, right? Kind of when you register webhook as like as far as I know, there hasn't been any really update on that front. And I did see actually like quite a few comments around not having an API or like a GraphQL mutation to actually register those new type of event subscriptions, and having to kind of like do it for everyone at once through your app toml, right? And so I can see like quite a bit of risk there in the sense like, okay, do I actually want to go out on this all the merchants, or can I like progressively roll this out on only a couple of my installs, right? And start looking at the do like progressive rollout and so on, and like iron out the quirks.
Yeah, I don't know, and I will be corrected for this, I'm sure, by the internet if I'm wrong. But you might be able to use a filter on the events, the query filter. You might be able to filter it down to specific stores, but don't quote me on that.
That's
I'd have to
clever. It
check on
sounds
that
like
one.
that's kind of a workaround, but it might work, right? Like filtering on specific shops or whatever. I don't know if the, I guess, yeah, I guess your GraphQL query could return the shop ID, and then you could filter on that shop ID presumably.
Yeah, so because that's the flexibility you've got now, and also I think the important thing is to say that it's not like webhooks are going away, so you don't need to like big bang move over. Or I certainly haven't heard anything they're going away. I assume and deeply hope that that's not the case. But they're not going away, so you also could like set it up and run it in parallel for a bit, until you're comfortable with it, or like effectively A/B rollout between the two as it becomes stable. So that could also be an option there.
Yeah,
I was going to
and
jump in and say that there was some of this too, at least that was covered a bit in the community forum post. So there's like an FAQ and stuff like that came out with the announcement. So they did say like GraphQL based subscription management is planned for a later stage. So all that stuff is like coming soon TM kind of type thing or whatever. But they're working on it. I know that like they're very thoughtful about like a lot of these real use cases.
yeah, and that on its own actually does sound like a pretty meaningful change too, because it's almost kind of like a whole new interface into those events. Anyway, so we'll see exactly what they mean by that, but I'm sure folks are very much looking forward to that. That brings me kind of like to your rollout strategy for this, right? Do you see yourself kind of like adopting from day one, the very minute that they declare it as stable, especially Sandesh like coming back? I know you guys are probably like, spending thousands of dollars a month in unnecessary queuing costs and so on. And so is that something that's kind of like top of the list as soon as this lands, like we're on it? Are you already kind of like running this in parallel or testing it? Like what kind of urgency do you put to this migration?
Yeah, as soon as possible. I don't think there's denying that. It seems like with this release, they're pretty much saying that's available to try out, and yeah, we're just waiting for the right topics to come out. But aside from that, it's a very easy yes, especially because like the teams tried it out, and the feedback that they have is that it's ready to go. Again, I just go back to thinking about other stuff where we've had to hold back, like managed pricing, where we just had to be careful with thinking about whether we can do this or not. But this is way more straightforward. And yeah, the cost is a real thing for us. Like out of our AWS bill, like half of it is pretty much just consuming webhooks, queuing them, making sure we can manage it. And if Shopify is coming in and telling me, hey, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Here's a thing to help you like bring your bill down by 50%, 75%. I don't know. That's like somebody giving me money for free. I just, I just have to say yes. And it's been well thought out too. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that sounds like a really meaningful change to your business at the end of the day.
Yeah,
Like,
it is.
50%
And
of that AWS bill is what, 50% of your COGS at the
yeah,
So, yeah.
exactly. It's meaningful, and I think like especially in the Shopify world, like the more money you can put into other stuff like the product itself and support, I think the better off you are. So for me, it's just when I think about cost, I don't think like how can I bring everything down so I take up more margin. It's more like how do I increase my margin so I can spend more on the things that merchants can see upfront. And I think this is allowing us to do that. So yeah, day one, we're in.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you were in a day minus one. And
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
just to add on there, I think the other thing is also, and I'm sure everybody has seen this during BFCM, like the number of webhooks coming in from Shopify during that time is insane. And you have to prep like weeks ahead to scale up. And if you don't, like we thought we did, but we didn't end up, everything suffers downstream. So I remember like our last BFCM, we had an insane number of webhooks to the point where our dashboard would go down because we're running a monolith and everything is just coming in and the workers have to scale up, but our database connections eventually end up running out. So everything ended up being a mess, even though we thought we scaled up for it really well. So I will take anything that means we can provide a more stable experience for merchants.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, some folks have been coming to us for like the deduplication and so on. And some people have kind of pinged me and be like, oh, do you think that like diminishes the value of book deck and so on? And maybe, but ultimately, I think the point I was trying to make is like, look, like we still needed to receive all the webhooks that you don't want, and we had a cost to filter those out, right? And we're like kind of ultimately, and maybe we're doing it marginally cheaper and so on, but there's inherent just waste going on there. So I think the fact that they're doing this is better for everybody. Shopify also is probably going to be meaningfully cheaper for them to not actually have to go out and send those. I wonder how much of your use cases did actually go out and like fetch GraphQL kind of or API requests in response of those webhooks, because I think that's very much like the last argument that we were making, right? Of trying to reduce kind of like the amount of queries that you then have to make to the Shopify API and worry about the rate limiting for each of the different stores, like on those, right? So how much do you see that making a big difference as well?
Yeah, so I built a custom pipeline for product updates, sending over to like a merchandising tool back when I was employed by a Shopify merchant, and we made a lot of GraphQL requests to enrich it with like translation data, because you can't get that on any webhook at all. And you want that to be updated as quickly as possible. There's some other data like on the products that you could never get out of anything apart from going to the admin. And at the time, we were very fortunate to be able to go to Shopify and be like, please, can I have more rate limits, which they offered. And that was great, but it was a real stressor on like, we're really worried that we're just going to hit the rate limit and this pipeline's just going to break. So I think that it's going to be a big win for that. Especially for people like Harold, who runs Bundles app. He does shitloads of webhooks, and also Luke, who does Stockful, is doing loads of inventory webhooks. So I think, particularly in their use cases, it's going to be a really big win. And Sandesh, as well, as working more efficiently, like working smarter, not harder, I think is the summary. I think.
Yeah, we are +1 on the inventory thing. Like every inventory update just means we end up making more GraphQL calls to actually get what we need. So not having to do that will be amazing.
And it also means you can get inventory in multiple different states now, whereas before you couldn't attach that inventory at all, which is a huge win for inventory apps.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys also receive webhooks from other platforms. I guess on closing thoughts, I'm wondering if there's obviously like I think Shopify has like such like ingrained tooling and developer ecosystem and so on that they can kind of get away with this, right? I don't know if every other platform could like go out there and like make their webhooks kind of like a pretty unique thing, but I'm wondering if there's like specific things there that in the other webhooks that you might be consuming you would hope for those platforms to kind of like take as lessons, right? Is there like specific changes that you think like should be more generally of like kind of part of what we expect of webhooks in general?
I don't know how everybody else can like maybe chime in on, but like as far as like a services side of things, like I deal with a lot of like external providers and webhooks, and so like that's something that there's one specific provider that they send literally every single a webhook for like every single event that could possibly happen for like loyalty and rewards and points. So points go up, points go down, scale to a different tier, so that like literally. And so like for a plus merchant or whatever with tons of customers, like that was our big issue was basically there all these things that we wanted to do we had to figure out a way to like handle webhooks. So I wish something like that would be there for that. So I'm hoping that this kind of a thing is also a signal for other like providers like to make things easier. But otherwise, like using other tooling, that was one of the things of in a recent thing I was like looking at like, oh, I need to use something like Hook Deck here for this. So I was very happy when you had reached out initially. And so but yeah, like that's I don't know about from the app side of things, so Jordan's probably like better at that piece for that, but like from a services side of things, yes, very much so. Would love to figure out how to like do a better job with all of this information that we get pummeled with.
I'm a bit of an event-driven architecture geek, admittedly. I've built many like event-driven platforms in AWS, and there's a really good book. I think it's called Flow Architectures, and this hits at this where as more systems get more complex and things, polling just doesn't work, right? As you scale, and as these older systems around us become more complex, I'm thinking Stripe and things like that, alongside Shopify, can do more, right? They offer more things, and it hinted at in this book of like, well, what about if every system just emitted events that you consumed? So rather than having to go off and poll and not hit everyone's APIs, alongside the APIs, they have events that you can push, and I guess that is kind of what webhooks have been to a degree, but again, without the configurability of like, I want this when this changes. And so I would be really interested if this is the start, because others watch, right? What Shopify does leak out into other platforms, both e-commerce and not. And so I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to watch how this is adopted, both by like Shopify apps, app devs, merchants, etc. But also see how the wider tech ecosystem adopts it. I'd also love to see the graph metrics of like how many webhooks are sending per topic. I think that would just be genuinely fascinating from a Shopify side of things. When they do their Black Friday post about how much they scale up the infrastructure, I'd love to see the share of webhooks across all the different topics. I think that would just be, as a geek, that would be fascinating to scale.
Yeah, actually, we should publish those numbers. We should be able to run some stats on this. And I remember I did look it up at least once, and it was in the 88-90% like product update inventory related webhooks. But it'd be good to dive into like that distribution. Obviously, like genuine inventory update that you do actually care about. Like I don't know if this update is going to do much about it, because at the end of the day you do need like that update. I do think, however, it's going to lead to smaller payloads, because now your GraphQL query can like specifically only return the inventory, that sort of stuff. Like across deck in general, we're seeing average payload size on Shopify about 9 to 10 kilobyte on average, which is quite big. Like ultimately, like that ends up resulting in networking costs and in queuing costs, depending on which queue you use and if it charges per bandwidth and that sort of stuff. So I can see like a ton of optimization there. To piggyback on what you're saying on the event-driven architecture kind of nerdness, obviously a topic I could talk a lot about, but in terms of this influence, I definitely think Shopify is going to have an influence on everyone else, and it's kind of like our job as developers to like carry that expectation to others, right? Like here's what they're doing, I'd love to see this, and so on to the other vendors that we work with. But I will say, I also think, and you're purely speculating, but I do think that Shopify itself also is seeing influence from others. Like one of the big thing that struck my attention is the change in terminology, moving away from webhooks to event subscriptions, to your point, Jordan. And I think that very much like follows in the step of what Stripe did about 2 years ago, where now webhooks are like event destinations. And they no longer call them webhook either. And obviously, like Deck is playing kind of like its part with our Outpost product, which enables to send webhooks directly to message queues, and so send events that are actually message queues like PubSub or SQS or Deck itself, obviously. I appreciate your time, guys. First time doing kind of a live like this. It was a bit last minute, but I thought it was like the topic of the day, so we needed to get on it. It was super fun to OC you and chat, and we should do this more often.
Yeah, it was really good.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. Take care. Have a great weekend, everyone, if you tuned in. Otherwise, this is going to be available as a recording. So I hope people are going to catch up on it.
See you later.
Take it easy.
Cheers.